Have you ever gotten exactly what you wanted, and still felt empty afterward? That moment of pleasure so vivid, so consuming fades faster than you expect. And in its place, a quiet ache. A question you can't quite name. A hunger that never seems to end. Desire promises happiness. But what if that promise was never meant to be kept? What if desire doesn't lead to peace at all but keeps you running in circles, chasing shadows? In today's talk, we return to one of the Buddha's most radical insights. That the very thing we pursue for fulfillment, may be the very thing that's keeping us from it. This video isn't about guilt. It's not about rejection. It's about clarity. It's about freedom. Stay with me until the end because the truth we uncover may finally explain why lasting peace has always felt just beyond your reach. And if these reflections speak to something within you, I invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to Lotus of Dharma. Together, let's awaken from the chase. Desire, by its very nature, is restless. It does not sit quietly within us, it stirs, it hungers, it leans forward into the next thing, the next person, the next sensation. It whispers, just one more, and when it gets what it wants, it begins whispering again. The Buddha likened sensual craving to a drop of water falling onto a red-hot iron. For a brief moment, there is a hiss, a flash of satisfaction, and then, nothing. The iron remains hot. The desire returns. Again and again. This is not because we are weak. It is because desire, by design, is unsatisfied. Its energy is not built for contentment. It is built for continuation. What most people call pleasure is not true peace. It is merely the pause between cravings, a fleeting stillness before the wanting begins again. And we confuse that pause for happiness, not realizing it is only the eye of the storm. You see, desire does not seek fulfillment. It seeks repetition. Its deepest craving is not to be satisfied, but to be fed. This is why, even after the most pleasurable experience, the mind rarely rests. It turns, it questions, it longs for a replay. The satisfaction fades quickly, but the momentum, the inner pull remains. The Buddha taught, it is in the nature of craving to multiply. Like a creeper, it grows wherever it can cling. And so we chase. We pursue. Not because we are evil or sinful, but because we do not see clearly. We think desire points toward peace. But what it actually points to is more desire. It is a self-reinforcing cycle. The more we chase, the more we want. The more we grasp, the more fragile we feel. It is like drinking salt water, appearing to quench thirst, but deepening it with every sip. That is the nature of desire. It is a fire that asks for wood even as it consumes the forest. And until we learn to watch it without obeying it, we will always be tired. Tired not just in body, but in spirit. Because no matter how much we give to desire, it always asks for more. So the first act of wisdom is not to destroy desire, but to understand it. To feel its heat, to observe its rhythm, to see how it rises and how quickly it falls. And in that seeing, something beautiful happens. The fire begins to lose its power, not because we have extinguished it through force, but because we have stopped adding fuel. There is a strange quiet after pleasure, a silence that should feel like peace, but somehow does not. Even in the most blissful moments, a subtle unease creeps in. A question, soft but persistent, arises in the back of the mind. Will I feel this again? Will it last? Was it truly enough? This is the shadow that follows pleasure, not because pleasure is wrong, but because we cling to it with trembling hands. The Buddha named this subtle ache dukkha, a word often translated as suffering, but its true meaning is more delicate, more intimate. Dukkha is the sense that something is always just slightly off. That even in joy, there is an undercurrent of fear. That even in gain, there is a whisper of loss. It is not the absence of happiness, but the inability to rest in it. The moment we begin to identify with what brings us joy, we begin to fear its departure. We build mental walls around what we love, and then suffer trying to keep them from falling. This is the root of restlessness, not desire alone, but the attachment to outcomes we cannot control. And so, we live guarded, watching our pleasures like fragile glass, hoping they don't slip through our hands. We become anxious even in happiness, afraid it might end, or worse, never come again. But real peace, the kind the Buddha spoke of, does not arise when we force desire into silence. It arises when we stop expecting desire to deliver what it cannot. When we stop asking impermanent things to bring permanent fulfillment. A sunset is beautiful not because it lasts forever, but because we stop asking it to. Pleasure is not the problem. Expectation is. Desire is not the poison. Identification is. When we look closely, we see that restlessness is not something imposed from outside, it is born from within, from the tension between wanting something and fearing its loss. To live with peace is to let go of that tension. To enjoy what arises without clinging, and to release it without regret. Not because we no longer feel, but because we no longer fear. That is when restlessness dissolves. Not in the absence of pleasure, but in the presence of wisdom. When desire arises, most people instinctively follow it. They move toward it, speak from it, act on it, believing it to be urgent, unquestionable, even necessary. But the Buddha, in his deep compassion, did not teach us to run after every impulse. He offered another way: observe it. Sit quietly. Let it arise. Let it burn. And let it pass. Desire is not your enemy. It is a visitor. And like all visitors, it will leave if you do not invite it to stay. The true source of suffering is not that desire appears. It is that we cling to it, identify with it, obey it without reflection. In doing so, we become bound not by the feeling itself, but by our reaction to it. As Ajahn Chah wisely said, you cannot stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. You cannot control what thoughts or urges arise in the mind, but you can learn to stand steady as they roll through. And in that steadiness, something shifts. You are no longer a captive, you are a witness. Mindfulness becomes your surfboard. Stillness becomes your strength. This is not repression. It is refinement. It is the art of sitting with the fire without being scorched. Of hearing the voice of craving without following its commands. It is the discipline of non-reactivity, not through force, but through understanding. Just as a mountain is unmoved by the wind, the trained mind is unmoved by the waves of craving. It sees them. It feels their pull. But it does not move unless it chooses to. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha teaches, when lust arises in the mind, the practitioner knows, lust has arisen. When it fades, the practitioner knows, lust has faded. No shame. No suppression. Just pure seeing. The more we practice this inner watching, the more we realize, we are not the craving. We are the awareness that holds it. And awareness, unlike desire, does not grasp. It simply notices, and in that noticing, begins to untie the knots we've carried for so long. To observe without reacting is not passive. It is powerful. It is the doorway to freedom. Peace does not come from satisfying desire. It comes from being free of the need for desire to be satisfied. At first, This may sound like a paradox. How can we find joy by not getting what we want? But the Buddha's insight was never about rejecting life, it was about understanding the nature of our relationship to it. Desire is natural. It arises like wind through an open field. The problem is not that it comes, but that we believe we must follow it in order to be whole. We live in a world that teaches us to seek fulfillment through acquisition of pleasure, of approval, of connection. And so, we learn to measure peace by what we can attain or consume. But the peace that depends on outcomes is a fragile peace. The moment conditions change, it vanishes. It is not true freedom, it is conditional comfort. What the Dharma teaches is far more profound. The deepest joy arises not when every craving is met, but when the heart no longer trembles in their absence. This is not detachment out of denial. This is wisdom born from deep seeing. We begin to notice, the satisfaction that desire promises is always temporary. One moment we are full, the next we are reaching again. Like drinking from a leaking cup, the more we consume, the more thirsty we become. And slowly, a question arises within us, not from theory, but from lived experience: what if the peace I long for cannot be found in what I chase? There is an old saying in the Zen tradition: desire is a visitor. Awareness is the home. When we abide in awareness, present, grounded, observant, we begin to see desire for what it is, an impermanent wave, not an identity. We stop trying to feed it, and instead learn to sit with it. We see that we are not empty without it, we are simply still. True fulfillment, then, is not the result of indulging every impulse. It is the discovery that nothing outside us has ever held the key to our freedom. The more we return to the silent space within the breath, the body, the witnessing mind, the more whole we feel. Not because something has been added to us, but because nothing is pulling us away from ourselves. This is the peace of letting go, not through suppression, but through understanding. Not by closing the heart, but by opening it to a kind of joy that does not depend on getting or keeping. To be free from desire does not mean to live without feeling. It means to feel fully, without fear. To love without clinging. To experience without needing to possess. And in that space, we come home. Not to the fleeting pleasure of a fulfilled desire, but to the quiet contentment of no longer needing it. Letting go of sexual desire is not an act of rejection, it is an act of profound understanding. Among all human cravings, sexual desire is perhaps the most compelling. It is subtle, persistent, and deeply entwined with our sense of identity, connection, and even self-worth. It does not scream, it whispers. It reaches not only through the body, but through the heart's longing for intimacy, for validation, for union. That is what makes it so powerful. And that is what makes it so difficult to let go. The Buddha never condemned sexual desire as evil. He never labeled it as sin. Instead, he invited us to observe it with clarity and honesty. Why? Because desire, especially when it arises without awareness, tends to manipulate the mind. It promises wholeness, yet often leaves us more fragmented. It offers comfort, yet plants the seed of restlessness. The danger is not in desire's appearance, but in the illusion that it can complete us. Sexual craving often disguises itself as love. But love and craving are not the same. Craving seeks to possess, love seeks to understand. Craving grasps, love opens. Craving is anxious, love is steady. To let go of sexual desire, then, is not to become cold or indifferent. It is to stop looking outward for something that must be resolved inward. It is to see that the longing we feel is often not for a person but for relief from a deeper inner loneliness. And if we keep seeking others to fill that space, we remain dependent on their presence, their approval, their response. That is not love. That is bondage. Letting go is not suppression. It is seeing clearly. It is sitting still when the desire arises, watching it bloom, crest, and fade without moving, without obeying, without turning it into identity or action. And in that stillness, we learn, the energy of desire can be transmuted. Not destroyed, but refined. Turned into compassion, into clarity, into spiritual strength. As the Buddha said, freedom is not found through indulgence, nor through repression, but through understanding. Yes, sexual desire is the most difficult to master, not because it is the strongest, but because it hides behind so many beautiful illusions: connection, love, completeness. But when we strip away those stories, what remains is a raw force, one that can either rule the mind or be guided by wisdom. Letting go does not mean becoming averse to beauty, or immune to attraction. It means seeing without grasping, feeling without following, and ultimately, recognizing that the most intimate union is not with another but with the present moment, in full awareness, free from the pull of longing. This is not a denial of life. It is a rediscovery of its deepest truth, that nothing and no one outside of us is the source of our freedom. The moment we see this, not intellectually, but directly, desire loses its hold. And in its place, silence arises. Spaciousness returns. And the heart becomes light, open, and free. Mindfulness and meditation are not escapes from desire, they are the tools through which we understand its nature, and gently release ourselves from its grip. So much of our suffering does not come from the presence of desire itself, but from our inability to sit with it. We are so quick to act, to chase, to satisfy the pull, that we never truly look at it. But the Buddha did not teach suppression, he taught observation. He taught that liberation does not begin when desire disappears, but when we stop being ruled by it. In meditation, we create the space to see clearly. We do not try to silence the mind. We let it speak, and we listen not as a servant, but as a witness. The breath becomes our anchor. Each inhale and exhale returns us to what is real: this moment, this body, this awareness that does not grasp. The Buddha said, just as a solid rock is not shaken by the wind, so the wise are not moved by praise or blame. In the same way, the still mind is not moved by the waves of craving. When we sit in mindfulness, we begin to understand that the energy of desire is not evil. It is simply untrained. And just like a wild animal, it does not need to be destroyed, it needs to be gently tamed, with patience and clarity. We begin to feel how desire rises, peaks, and passes. We realize that we do not need to follow it every time it calls. We can just sit, breathe, and remain unmoved. This is not indifference, it is maturity. There is a monk who once said, "I spent years trying to fulfill every hunger inside me. I thought the answer was to keep finding more comfort, more company, more pleasure. But it was only when I sat still and did nothing that I realized I already had everything I needed. The only thing missing was silence." True freedom is not found in controlling desire, but in no longer being controlled by it. And that freedom begins in the stillness of meditation. When the mind no longer flinches from discomfort. When the body no longer rushes to escape it. When the breath is enough. In that moment, we are not rejecting the world, we are simply no longer consumed by it. We no longer need to chase every feeling, answer every impulse, or prove anything to anyone. And slowly, we begin to see. The deepest intimacy is not with another. It is with the present moment, fully embraced, without clinging. This is the quiet gateway to liberation, not paved by force, but by deep presence. Not guarded by rules, but open through wisdom. And the more we walk it, the less we need. until even the strongest desire becomes just another ripple on the surface of a calm, vast lake. So perhaps now you see desire was never the path to peace. It was the distraction from it. Its promises were always temporary, its satisfaction always fleeting. But within the quiet space of awareness, something deeper emerges. When we stop chasing, when we sit with the fire instead of feeding it, we discover that the stillness we longed for was never outside of us, it was beneath the noise all along. The Buddha did not ask us to suppress our nature, but to understand it. And through that understanding, we are no longer enslaved by longing, we are liberated by clarity. If this message has touched something within you, I invite you to carry it beyond this screen. Share your reflections in the comments. Let your insight help someone else awaken. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Lotus of Dharma so that together, we may continue walking the path from craving to clarity, from hunger to wholeness, from desire to peace.